Hello there. I'm just making this video really as a way of thinking out loud about some issues I've been trying to study and understand a little bit more um, in relation to my interests to do with veganism and human evolution, transhumanism, ethics, environmental issues, and so on. And I've centered in on the genetic mutations which led to human beings being able to digest lactase into adulthood. Now, lactase is what we get from milk. Human beings are mammals, of course, and their our mothers produce milk, which, like all mammals, we feed to our mothers feed to their young. They're gradually weaned off this in humans, as you know, within the first year or two. Different rates in other animals. And after that, going back into our evolutionary history, human beings weren't able to digest lactase. There was no reason for them to drink milk after they'd been weaned. They didn't drink the milk of other animals as we do today. And that was one reason was, as well as because of the fact we couldn't digest it, we hadn't domesticated animals, so we weren't really able to. But at some point in our history, we discovered that you could get some nutritional value from the milk of cows and other mammals that we were probably eating. But we hadn't domesticated them as we have since. Human beings, of course, are originally hunter-gatherers. And approximately, well, we think about 8,000 years ago, something like that, 10,000 thereabouts, human beings started to domesticate animals and drink milk. And as well as domesticating crops, this all is part of the development of agriculture, which is what facilitates our shift from a nomadic hunter-gatherer species to a more complex species that develops what we call civilization. We no longer have to roam, live from hand to mouth, or live from day to day, as it were, getting meat when we can, when we've hunted it, and persisting for the rest of the time on anything else we can find, nuts and berries, fruit, anything that grows, really. So what's very interesting is there are, I believe, at least two separate genetic mutations in our history that have allowed for us to digest lactase into adulthood. And this has allowed some human beings, I believe some are from East Africa and the rest are from Europe, if you trace back the genetic history. This has led some human beings to, well, it's given them a selective advantage. There's a lot of nutrition that you can get from milk. Those people who are able to digest it without getting ill are more likely to survive and reproduce, and so the genetic mutation is passed on and becomes more dominant. That's how evolution often happens. And what's very, very interesting to me is how this seems to be connected in some way that I haven't quite worked out with the development of civilization itself. Early agriculture had dramatic effects on humans, fairly obviously. Why did we first begin farming? And we don't know exactly, except for the, obvious sort of general observations that it's easier than hunting and gathering. But what I'm trying to get at is the evolution doesn't have any goal. It doesn't have any particular purpose. It just happens. There's no end in sight. It just changes over time. speciation, diversification. So when we're thinking about evolution in relation to ethics, there's a lot of interesting questions that we have to ask. Social Darwinism, fascism, extreme forms of capitalist individualism are all about the primacy of the individual. People are rewarded for doing what is beneficial to them, rewarded economically, rewarded sexually, rewarded socially in various ways. Social Darwinism is a very sort of pernicious idea that takes Darwinism as an evolutionary theory and tries to apply it to societies. And whereas in evolution, it's just about what happens over time, when you bring it into the sphere of politics and ethics and human society and civilization, people try to add to it a normativity, an oughtness. This happens in the biological process, therefore this should happen in human societies. And that's quite a dangerous idea. It's not a very egalitarian idea, it's not a very progressive idea, and it's why it's associated with things like Nazism, eugenics, various forms of racism, hypercapitalism, and so on. There's often a religious dimension to it as well. We're now at the point in our evolution where we've discovered what evolution is. That's quite a recent development. It's only in the last 150 years that we've really had any understanding at all of the process of evolution. Dennett says that Darwin's theory is the most important idea anyone has ever had. And he says that because it is something that we can take and apply to so many other spheres of our existence outside of just the purely biological, the deterministic, if you like. And that's where ethics again comes in. So when we think about veganism is a movement that is a philosophical, ethical position against the using of non-human animals for purposes other than their own. So not eating them, not drinking their milk, not eating their eggs, and so on. Not domesticating them, effectively. We've domesticated and exploited animals on a massive scale now. Billions and billions every year are slaughtered and killed and exploited for their entire lives for human gain, as we know. And again, there's been some advantage to that. Meat is a very rich source of nutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, and so on, as is milk, as are eggs. And it's something that we can take control of by dominating animals, which we're doing now to the detriment of the whole planet, our own species, as well as all the other species that we kill and torture. So when we think about where we may have got to now in the stage in our evolution where we are in the midst, really, of an environmental crisis, there's no longer any point saying it's in the future. It's a possibility. It's happening. There are already climate refugees. There are already people that have been killed because of, and are dying and are suffering all over the world because of human dominance of the planet through burning fossil fuels and farming animals, animal agriculture on a massive scale. And all of that seemed, going further back in history, like a good thing. Here we've got Norman Burlock, who is the father of the Green Revolution, credited, I believe, with probably saving 1 billion people's lives just because of the work he did on crops, developing disease-resistant strains that could withstand the harsh climate. There is an example of human beings taking some control over the evolutionary process, directing it through selective breeding for the benefit of our species. And in Norman Burlock's case, it's a very deliberate attempt, but going back to prehistoric times, it's questionable, obviously, how deliberate it was. We just do what works without really thinking about implications or on any kind of global scale, because we're not at that level yet. It's very interesting to me that the beginnings of civilization seem to be tied up with the beginnings of animal domestication, the beginnings really of global human dominance, a single species dominating the entire planet through the deliberate processing, if you like, of crops and the treating of animals as food, as property. And there's been a lot of historical justification for this over time. You go back to the idea of the great chain of being, the great medieval idea that the order of the universe is really fixed with God right at the top, the first link in the chain. And then you've got the supernatural beings, the angels, and then you have human beings, and then you have then you have men, and then slightly below that you have women, and then a whole other degree below that you have all other animals. And men, or human beings, are ensouled. They are between the two worlds. They are both natural and divine, natural and partially supernatural. They have souls, which animals are thought not to have. And that sort of crystallizes in Cartesian dualism and the birth of the modern era. Modern philosophy, again, highly individualistic. So we developed because of, arguably, perhaps, our domestication of animals, which was facilitated by accident as a result of a couple of genetic mutations, which had selective advantage, allowed us to reproduce and live longer, more healthier, and more fulfilling lives in a lot of ways. We developed culture. We move from agriculture to culture to civilization. We don't have to be constantly just looking for food. We can find food, we can store it up, we can process it, we can bake bread, we can cure meat in various ways. We can preserve it, so we freeze up all this time to develop culturally, spiritually, artistically, technologically, of course. And over time, that gives us more and more freedom to do more and more things, and it just has an exponential effect. It's why progress itself progresses at a faster rate as time goes on. And we've hit the wall. We are really at the limits of how we're at the limit of the planet can no longer sustain this kind of behavior of one species for much longer. It seems it's already dying, and it's dying because of this imbalance between humans and all other life. So we're kind of a victim of our own success, and we're kind of a happy accident, but we're also a terrible mistake if you want to look at it in teleological terms. I just think that's very, very interesting. Thanks for listening.